Welcome to Sharkie's Gaming Controllers. I'm Sharkie, and in today's video we'll be taking a look at the ASCII Stick L5 for Famicom. This is a dedicated RPG controller that only needs one hand to operate. Now I don't actually have the packaging for this controller, so I'll just put an image up here showing the front of the packaging so you can sort of see what it looks like. So as you can see, it comes in a very simplistic plastic packaging with a cardboard backing. You can of course see the controller through the plastic, and there's a lot of Japanese writing, basically explaining that this is a dedicated RPG controller and some of its features. So now that you've seen the packaging, let's have a look at the controller itself. So this is the front of the controller just there, and the side, the back, the other side, the top, and the bottom. And the bottom here, it has the name and the model number. It also says the year, so 1989, so it sure ages this controller. It also says made in Taiwan. Now this is a cabled controller, so it's got a Famicom connector on the end of it there, and the cable is a decent length. On the top of the controller here, the first thing that you see is this bright red D-pad, and this D-pad is fairly small. I mean, pretty much your thumb covers almost the whole D-pad. That's how small it is. Now this D-pad also has quite square edges. You can see how kind of square those edges, and that's not necessarily an issue. It's only an issue when your thumb goes too close to those edges and presses down, because you'll feel that squareness. It kind of presses in to your thumb. So it's better just to play, if you can try and move your thumb over a little bit so it's not as close to the edge, it'll be a lot more comfortable. Because that hard edge, once you start playing with this controller for a while, it gets pretty uncomfortable as it digs into your thumb. So definitely a down point for this D-pad. D-pad's quite easy to press. It doesn't make that much noise. You can hear a click, but it's not too loud. Now next to this D-pad, you've got the start and select buttons. These are small teal buttons. They're quite easy to press, although you do need to stretch your thumb across the controller to be able to reach them properly. So that can be a little bit uncomfortable after a long play session. Flipping this over onto the back. So on the back here, you've got your A and B buttons. These are kind of elongated, very narrow with an indentation in the center. The indentation's meant to kind of fit your fingers in, but because of the shape of these buttons, they do look smaller than what they actually are. You see these ridges here, they're quite high, and so when you put your fingers don't quite 100% align to those indentations, so a lot of times when you start to press them, you'll start to feel those ridges. Now these ridges on these buttons aren't as sharp as, say, the D-pad. You can see how square that D-pad is. These are actually quite smoothed off, but after a while of playing, they're still gonna press into your fingertips. As you can hear, they've got quite a nice click to them, but they're actually quite hard to press. You actually got to press with quite a bit of force to get them to trigger. And the other thing also, when you're holding this controller, is to basically remember to not squeeze these buttons by accident. You basically just need to get used to the controller and holding it, so that when you're playing and you're using the D-pad, you're not accidentally squeezing these two fingers and accidentally pressing those buttons, because it can easily happen. So that's another thing to be aware of with this controller. Now holding this controller is actually quite comfortable, far more comfortable than the standard Famicom gamepad. Now a part of this is its design. So first off, you can see how if you hold it straight like this, the whole controller sort of angles to the right there. And this is just so that when you're holding it with your hand, it's more comfortable to access these buttons. They are much more in a natural position. So this reduces fatigue while you're playing, because your wrist and hand is in a natural position and quite rested. Now you do have to stretch your thumb a bit to reach these two buttons here, but other than that, these buttons are very easy to access. The D-pad is very easy to access there as well, so you don't have to stretch too much unless you want to press the start and select, which is just a little bit of a stretch in your thumb there. Now if you do this quite often, that can get a bit uncomfortable, but other than that, it's pretty good on the front here. Now on the back, it's got these really nice kind of grips here, and this just allows your hand to grip it really nicely. You can see how your fingers kind of slot between those two grips to press those buttons. So it's really nice and comfortable on the back there. It feels quite natural to grip and hold. The one thing you do have to get used to though with this grip is just how to grip it. So you need to grip with these bottom two fingers here and press against your palm. If you grip too much with these top two fingers, then you're going to accidentally press these buttons. And it's very easy just to squeeze a little bit too much and press those buttons. Even though these buttons are quite hard, they're still quite easy to press, but this really comes down just to get used to using this controller. Once you're used to it, you kind of know you should squeeze using these ones and not using these fingers until you actually need to press those buttons. Now, the one thing to note with this controller is only for left-handed use, so you can only hold this in your left hand. If you try to hold it in your right, it just does not fit properly. You can sort of get away with it, but it'll be incredibly uncomfortable because you just can't grip it properly. So it's really only designed to be used in your left hand. I haven't found an easy way. Maybe if you wanted a challenge, you could try use it with your right, but yeah, there's just no easy way to do it. Now basically, this controller is fairly comfortable to use one-handed. The one thing that kind of wears you down the comfort level is the pressing those buttons. So the D-pad being sharp on the edges, after a while, your thumb's going to get uncomfortable. If you have to stretch quite a bit, like I mentioned before, that also gets uncomfortable. And of course, these back buttons with those ridges as well. So I guess the overall shape of this controller is very comfortable to hold and definitely more comfortable than a standard Famicom gamepad. I would say like for longer periods of play, it's definitely more comfortable. The only thing that lets it down though is pressing those buttons and the D-pad. Just the edges they get really uncomfortable, especially if you've been playing for quite a bit of time. They just dig into your fingertips and you'll start to feel it. So it's something that if you want to play with this controller, while it is overall pretty comfortable, the button presses will get uncomfortable, so you may need to have a break from time to time. So what is this controller actually used for? Well, basically this is a dedicated RPG controller. So on the Famicom, you could be sitting there playing your RPGs. The idea being that RPGs are much more slower paced and don't generally need really fast movements and key presses. So you can take your time and explore the RPG that you're playing. You holding this controller with your left hand, then with your right hand, which is free because it doesn't need two hands for this controller. Your right hand could be referencing a map, maybe looking at a guide. You could also be quite easily using pen and paper to leave notes for yourself, or perhaps drawing a map of the game world so you can navigate it more easily. You could also easily be having a drink or eating a snack as well. So it has many different uses to have a one-handed controller. Now it does work reasonably well with a slower paced RPG. If you try to use this with an action game, you could still use it quite easily. I mean, it works quite well, but the responsiveness of the buttons will probably end up being very frustrating because like I mentioned before, like these back buttons are quite hard to press, and again those ridges. So if you're playing a faster game, your fingers are going to be sore by the end of it, of repeatedly pressing it, also probably pressing these buttons quite hard to try and get them to trigger quickly. So it's going to be much more fatiguing long term. So it's probably not ideal to play like an action-paced game, especially if it's quite repetitive button pressing, especially for a long time, because you'll just find it gets really uncomfortable and maybe even a bit frustrating. So it's definitely a controller that's designed for a slower paced RPG. You can play with your leisure, take your time, have this in your left hand, and then be using your right hand to do something along the lines of, referencing some sort of material, or like I said, you could quite easily just have a snack, have a drink while you're playing. So it's just more of a laid back controller that just requires one hand to play your favorite RPG. Overall, this is a very cool retro one-handed controller. It does work quite well with slower paced RPGs, as it's designed as a dedicated RPG controller after all. It's quite nice to hold, feels very comfortable in the hand, far more comfortable than a standard Famicom gamepad. And the fact that you can use this one-handed while playing your favorite RPGs is quite a cool thing. The downside, of course, is that this can only be used in your left hand, so you've got to get used to using it in your left. It's not interchangeable, so you can't use your right hand, unfortunately. But the fact that it is a one-handed controller, it's still pretty awesome. The major thing I think that could have been improved is the fact that both this D-pad and the A and B buttons on the back here have very hard and sharp edges that dig into your fingers after a long period of gaming. It may be okay in the beginning, but after a while you'll really start to feel it and it'll start to get quite uncomfortable. I think part of this could be the fact this controller may have been designed with children in mind. So maybe if you have very small fingers, perhaps the edges wouldn't be as much of an issue. But definitely if you use it now and you've got bigger hands or bigger fingers, you're going to really feel it, especially these back buttons. It's just such a small indentation there and the ridges are so high there. It's going to get tiring eventually. So the buttons and the D-pad could definitely be improved. Even though that it's not perfect though, I still think it's a great controller to play with RPGs. I mean, it's designed for RPGs, it works well, especially with like, your standard slower pace RPG. If you try to use this with action games, it's definitely not the greatest. It can definitely be used, but those kind of action-paced games that need good reaction time and fast button presses, this controller is definitely not designed to be used with those type of games. Can it be done? Yes, but after a while, your fingers are going to hurt and you're probably going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. It's just the hard buttons on the back here, the fact the ridges are uncomfortable when they press into your fingers. Just overall with that type of action-paced games, I just don't think it's worth playing with this controller. Definitely stick with RPGs with this thing. Even though this controller is not perfect though, I still like it. It's really cool, it's got a really interesting design, and it's very unique. It's really a really cool controller. So it's definitely not the greatest controller, but it's a cool retro controller. And I mean, when you think about it, this was 1989 for Famicom, and it's a one-hand controller. It's so novel for the era, and it's really cool and very interesting. So it definitely would make a great addition to a Famicom collection. And another upside is this controller is still very easy to find even today, so it's very easy to get a hold of it and add it to your collection. Anyway guys, that was the ASCII Stick L5 for Famicom. If you liked the video, then please hit that like button as it really helps a lot. Don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss any of my new videos, as I'll have heaps more gaming controllers and accessories up very shortly. If you'd like to support my channel, then click the join button and become a channel member. You get monthly perks and the extra support really helps me out a lot. Thanks again for watching guys, I'll see you in the next one.